Go ahead, Arlie.
Yate shidinado shike. Arlineska shinishla. Nansteja Kachini. My mom in Sinsakadni, Bashchin, Kurchini, Dashichi, Plasche, Dashinala, but ego the Nenchla. Thank you, one and all relatives, for coming to be here. My name is Arlene Neskai. I'm a member of the Dinah Nation, and we're glad that you've joined with so many others to participate in this screening. And it's a time for our people that we've been waiting for many decades and years, where the true history of what happened to our ancestors has come to light. And we're grateful for all of you out there who are willing to see the truth and hear the truth. And a lot of stories, as I was a child, my parents told me, warned me, when you go to school, you're going to hear things in there that aren't quite right about our people. And if you ever want to know something, you can ask us, because we know what the truth is, and don't feel bad about it. And when I had children and I sent them to school, I did the same thing. So we have kept these truths within our hearts and our minds, and within even our very bodies and spirits for so long. And so even though it's difficult, it's very traumatic to be and hear and what's beginning to happen in the US and Canada, it's also a time and an opportunity. So tonight we're going to have a panel discussion. We're very honored to have these people with us tonight, and I'll be serving as moderator and sharing some of my thoughts too. Oh yeah, I forgot. I'm coming to you from the traditional homelands of the Muckleshoot people in Renton, Washington, and very grateful for all the Coast Salish people for all that they've done, their prayers and ceremonies and sacrifices over the years to take care of this land. They've treated me really well, and whenever I go home, I always talk good about them. So I'm glad to be here and to share in this community. So we have our elder here, Ramona Bennett. She's one of the longtime leaders of the Puyallup people, and she's got a really strong history, not just within her people, but across the nation, to tell you the truth. And we'll hear some of her stories and things like that. And I asked her if I could share to all of you who may not know her. She's got a long history of activism too as well. And when I asked her about that, she said, not only that, you can call me a radical. So it's really true. And we're going to talk about that, how during the 70s and during that time, many of our people began to speak, found their voice, and stood our ground. We also have Jason Lafontaine, and he's going to introduce him a little bit later, and he's going to introduce himself. And he works for the Puget Sound ESD at this time, and he'll give a fuller introduction. We also have Valerie St. Pierre, Upsalaga Nation, and she's here too, and she might be talking and sharing some of her thoughts. We've been told that she attended a boarding school back in the 60s, so we're very grateful that she might be willing to share as well. So with that, I just want to go ahead and get started here, and we'll start with you, Ramona. Would you share with us, seeing this video and hearing the recounting of these stories and the children who are buried far from home, what sort of feelings does it bring up within you? I want the people to understand that we carry these thoughts and memories. They've been with us. So how does that affect you personally?
It's painful that our children have died away from home and are scattered out. Their spirits feel lost to me. They should never have been taken away in the first place, and they certainly didn't leave knowing they would never make it back. I mean, they should be home. And you make me jealous because I hear you speaking your language, and my mother was a language speaker.
Hmm.
But when she talked Indian, um, she wouldn't let me speak back to her because she didn't want me to get beat up at school
Hmm.
for saying Indian words. And so oddly, when I worked for a Jewish wholesaler in Chicago, um, I cussed out my boss in what I thought was perfect Puyallup, and he understood me. I was speaking Yiddish, and I called my mom and asked her, "How comes I speak Yiddish?" And she said that she was always rented out to Jewish families. And it turns out that the Indian kids, when they were in the industrial school, that is the main Puyallup BIA school, the kids were rented out to families. And the boys were in the agricultural program. They learned how to take care of white people's fences, shovel manure in white people's stalls, um, feed chickens, just generally do farm work. And the girls were in the domestic sciences program, and they learned to iron white people's clothes and sheets, and change white people's babies' diapers, and mop white people's floors. And whatever family they were with, of course, spoke American because no one speaks English in America. And they learned how to speak Yiddish if they were with a Jewish family. My mom was always rented to Jewish families. And the only way I found that out was by cussing out my boss in Chicago. If I hadn't been, I wouldn't have ever known that little factoid. But my mom was beat bloody for saying her words um, in the boarding school. And so she didn't want me to get in trouble. And so in the 50s, apparently, or in the 40s and 50s, I was being taught Yiddish as a safer language than Tulshutsid. And now, does that make any sense to you when you think what was happening to people who spoke Jewish in the 40s?
Mhm.
It didn't to me, but my mom apparently thought I'd be safer speaking Yiddish than speaking an Indian language. And so that's how it was. The kids were punished severely for saying their own words. And they also went hungry. And my mom was in the Puyallup industrial school, and Kaya brought beef, deer meat, salmon, chickens, brought food, to help feed the children, but they weren't fed. And so she came to the school and packed my mom up and moved her to St. George's the first day of Lent, which is the beginning of fasting, as you probably know. And I'm just throwing that in because it was a very unfortunate timing. So my mom got moved to St. George's, and she was just a little girl when she went to St. George's, and they were tough on the kids. They were very very so strict. It was abuse. And my mom told me later, if you think about it, you know, you're you're putting an ad in a paper in Boston for someone to come work with the kids. So what do you say? You say, we need service staff and instructing staff, and we need managers in a program where children are captives. They're brought against their will. They do not speak English, and they are removed from all protective adults. So what do you get? You get people with Bibles who've come to save their little savage souls. You get people who are incompetent, who couldn't get a job anyplace else, and you get pedophiles, and that's what they got. They got incompetence. They got sexual abusers, and they got people who were going to save them, whether they wanted to be saved or not. And so these little kids, ranging in age, I thought from 4. Here it was 4. That's the youngest I ever heard of. Valerie said she was 3, and you'll get to talk with her later. But little kids would be dragged off when they were as little as 4, and it went by how tall they were. And when Freeman Latterout was 95, he ran away from home. He had seen my name in a tribal paper, and he was Puyallup, and so he caught a cab from Mount Lake Terrace, and he came to Hawthorne, which was a sender that we had gotten from the Tacoma Public Schools. And he caught a cab and came on into town, and he was looking for me, and the cab driver actually found Hawthorne and brought him in, and he was in tears. He didn't know anybody. He had not been back to the reservation since he got dragged off to boarding school. And so he came from his niece's home to Hawthorne, and the staff there wanted someone he could relate to, so they brought in Martin Sampson. And Martin Sampson was like 91. He was much younger. But when they seen each other, they just hugged each other and jumped up and down. And Freeman said Martin, and Martin said Freeman, and they just stood there holding each other and crying. They were so happy. And so when I came back, I asked, how did you know each other? And they were dragged off to school at the same time. Martin was only 4, Freeman was 8, but they were the same height because Martin was really big for his age, and Freeman was always small. And so they were dragged off at the same time. And Freeman was 8 years old, and he knew a little bit of English, a little bit of American. And Martin didn't know anything. He was a baby. And so Freeman took care of Martin. He guided him through and kept him safe, kept him from being beat up. And then as time passed, people started pushing Freeman around because he was itty bitty. But Martin kept growing. He got really big. And they got to be in the same classes and the same barracks. And so notice I said barracks, not group care or dorm. They were in unheated barracks. That's how it was out at St. George's. It was cold. It was so cold. And so Martin took care of Freeman all the way through, and he was big and nobody messed with him. And so the two of them, they got through boarding school alive. They didn't get beat up. But them barracks were not heated and they weren't insulated, and it was damn cold. And Mama said they had to sleep with their hands on top of the blankets. Their little brown hands would be blue. They'd be so cold. But them nuns thought that they would masturbate if they had their hands under their covers. And so they had to sleep with their hands on top of the covers. And the nuns would come through a couple of times a night doing a bed check to make sure that those kids had their hands on the covers. And my mom would see them nuns coming and walking through, and then as they'd leave, my mom would say, "They sure think a lot about masturbating," and all the kids would giggle. And my mom would get beat, but she'd do it every time because everybody was waiting for her to. She didn't like to let her little audience down. And so that's how I know that the barracks weren't heated and it was damn cold and they had to sleep with skinny little blankets on. They had a hard time, those kids. And when my mom said they moved her from Puyallup Industrial School on the first day of Lent, she wasn't kidding. They were starved and deprived of food, and all of the Indian families brought food in, but the kids got very little of it. And the government paid big money, and I'm sure the Catholics collected big money to take care of the kids. The little girls were all taught how to crochet and knit. I know I'm really making you think, aren't I? They would see, Valerie just came through to drop supplies off because we have a caravan heading down to the Mexican border Saturday morning, they're taking supplies for themselves, but they're going down to rally about children in cages, because we know how our indigenous children are treated when they're captives like that. And so she just stopped by, but she was 3 years old when she was dragged off with 125 other little 3-year-olds and 4-year-olds. And it's not good. And I do want to talk about St. George's because we, on Thanksgiving in 1974.
Ramona, really quickly, it's important, I think, for our listeners to understand when you mention these places, in the place, Puyallup Industrial School, then Puyallup Indian School, then Cushman School are all the same place. And for the viewers to know, right where the main Emerald Queen Casino is, in I-5 in Tacoma, that was the location of the school that she's talking about. So, for those of you, this is not far across the lands. There were boarding schools all across the country. And then she's going into talking about this other school. And could you tell a little bit about the location? And you were talking, it's right on the King County, Pierce County border, as from what you said.
It is. It's right on Highway 99. It was just torn down in the last 20 years. And well, maybe a little bit longer than that. But all in my lifetime. Of course, I'm an old bat. I'm 83, so that's but it's kind of current a current happening. The boarding school, the Puyallup Industrial School, was a wooden structure, and it was taken down when they put up the hospital, which I refuse to call Cushman, but it was known as the Cushman Hospital. And the St. George's was right on the Pierce King line, and it was on 80 acres. And we were told that the children in that school were told every day how lucky they were that white people in Europe and on the East Coast were tithed and made donations to buy that property for the Indians. They were told it was for you. It was for you kids. You kids are really lucky. If those people hadn't put up the money to buy this place, you would be uneducated, dirty little heathens, and you're getting a free education. You don't have to do anything to get this education. It's free. And my mom told me that they were beat stoic, that before they were hauled off like that, taken away from their families and their communities and all of the people that loved them, they were hauled in there, and they used to, she said, if there was a stump, there'd be an Indian telling a story, singing a song, doing a dance. Indians were outgoing and outspoken and fun-loving. But once they were dragged into boarding school, they were beat stoic. If they laughed, they were told, "Don't be foolish." If they frowned, they were told, "Don't even think it." And they were all emotions were beat out of them. Any emotion they showed, they got in trouble. And so they were beat stoic. They didn't laugh anymore. They didn't cry anymore. They didn't show anger anymore. They weren't allowed to have emotions. But who can have emotions? Who can dance a dance and sing a song and get in a fight? A drunk can. A drunk is allowed to have emotions. And so my mom said, so we drank to have feelings. And so my mom said, if you can dance a dance and sing a song and laugh and get in a fight and go off honeymooning, if you can do all of those things sober, then you won't ever have to drink. And she really meant it. I would never have to drink. And I am a sober person. I had to drink until I was in my early 30s, but I got past it. I came to realize that that she was really telling the truth. But I know we had the highest protein diet on the face of the planet with the salmons and the buffaloes. But I don't think it's because we crave sugar. I think it's because we crave having feelings. And so that's what she said. That's what I believe. I know the boarding schools taught her skills. I mean, she had the best American vocabulary of anyone I've ever known, and she used her words, and she eventually was a nurse. She did have strong academic skills, and I'm sure that she got them in boarding school. But the things that she didn't learn were sitting at the table with a husband, discussing schedules, budgets, tending children, she knew how to do laundry for 500 people, but she didn't know how to cook a meal for a small family. She knew how to boil potatoes for 500 people. She knew how to mop a floor in an institution. But our kids didn't learn anything about being part of a family, and the predators were all over the place in boarding schools, and that's a modeled behavior. And so we had that was modeled, and we had too many pedophiles within families. Sometimes the whole family circle is contaminated that way. And I'm really in distress because McNeil Island, which is supposed to be Wallachud, is where my ancestors live. And it's a storage place for pedophiles now. And they don't belong there. They shouldn't be there. I'm certain that my ancestors' spirits are disturbed, and that distresses me. I don't like them to be unhappy. It's like the children from Carlisle when they went out to St. George's. I said we occupied it one Thanksgiving, and when we were there, Archbishop Connolly had us arrested, and we wanted to meet with him. We invited him for Thanksgiving dinner, but he had us all arrested in 1974, and we were hauled into court in King County, because it is in King County, and it is right on the Pierce-King line. And that property is adjacent to what was eventually declared reservation. And Bill, who intended to speak on this broadcast, Bill Sterud's family is the Young family, and they actually had a cemetery on that property, a family cemetery. And Andy de Los Angeles, who is now deceased, was a photographer and writer for our little newspaper, and he went out there casing the place for us, checking it out, and he's seen people bulldozing a cemetery, and it was the Young family cemetery, and children who had died at the boarding school were buried there, and they were bulldozing their graves so they could sell that property to be a cemetery. And he took pictures of that and reported it to us, and reported it also to the Catholic Church, in case they didn't know what was happening. But anyway, we were arrested, and Archbishop Connolly had us arrested. And when we were in court now, the judge said, "I can't believe that the Catholic Church would want you to serve even 1 minute in jail," although we had been in jail overnight. And so anyway, Archbishop Connolly did his first press release in 9 years, and when he did his press release, he said we should have served at least 30 days each. And so that was his first press release in 9 years, and it was his last press release, because the next day he was gone, and they brought Hunt Hassan from Montana, and he was a priest that really got along with Indians, and so he was brought out here, and we did a tour with him. And I gotta tell you a story. Joe Washington, who's a Lummi, had come down, and he was doing a prayer, he was doing a blessing, and it was for all of the people who suffered there. And they did this walkthrough, and these reporters come running up to me, and they said, "Can we film this? Can we record this?" And I said, "Sure." And so they all run to Joe Washington with their cameras and their tablets and everything they had, and they all recorded his blessing. And then they all come running back to me and said, "Our cameras didn't work." Now that's power. That's real power, because the Times, the PI, the TNT, every channel Nobody got nothing because I can give permission, but if you're not supposed to record something, it just isn't going to record. And I tried to explain that to the people in Standing Rock. I don't think they got it, but
Ramona, I just want to say thank you for getting us started here. And I'd like to jump over to Jason for a bit here. And we really appreciate these memories. And as I was telling people when you tuned
let
in.
me,
Go ahead, Ramona.
yeah, Archbishop Hunthausen promised me that no indigent or displaced Indian would ever not have a burial plot, because that's one of the things that I told him is our displaced Indians who came out here at the government's bidding. Now, when they die, the BIA is not helping take them home, and he promised me that, and that property, every foot of it, was purchased for Indians only, and they are selling plots out there for $10,000-$20,000 each. And when April called for Marlene Two Buckets, that's her name she earned in Sweat Lodge, the woman that runs that cemetery said no one ever told her anything about that. And so there was no room for Marlene, who was from Fort Berthold. And the Nisquallies took her in, but the Catholics should have. That's all I wanted to say.
Thank you, Ramona. And as I mentioned when we got started here, these truths, as I see them, that are untold, and it's nothing that was ever talked about when I went to school or anything like that. These are very important. And so as you move forward and as the social justice movements are happening right now, it's important that you're willing to hear this. And we believe that it's a doorway, it's a beginning to help us move forward, as well as reconciliation efforts across the country to begin to happen. So with that, I want to go on to Jason. And Jason, seeing the video again and also listening to our elder here share what comes up for you and what kind of thoughts. And tell the people here, what's your relationship to boarding school with you and your family?
Sure. Well, first of all, I just want to thank, I'm honored to be here and listen to Ramona's stories. These are the stories that we are not taught, like you said, Arlie. We are not taught these stories in school. In school, they always teach us that Native people lived up to like 1890, and there's really nothing after 1890 that they teach us. That's 130 years of Native history that is not being taught in our schools. And so this is amazing that hopefully this is being recorded. You know, the spirits aren't deleting this like they did her ceremony. Just real quick, I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Jason Lafontaine. I am an enrolled member with the Turtle Mountain Band of Chippewa, which is a tribe in North Dakota. I'm the son of Robert Lafontaine, and I'm the grandson of Henry Lafontaine and Genevieve Blue. My grandmother, so I'm a second generation descendant of a boarding school experience. My father did not go to boarding schools, but both of my grandparents did. My grandfather never spoke about his experiences with my aunts and my father and my uncles. He had one story of just mischief that he ever told, and that was it. It was what my aunt told me. My grandmother, who fortunately, she's still alive. She's 100 years old. They left the reservation in the 1950s and they moved out to the Seattle area. And we've been out here, the LaFontaine family has been out here ever since the 1950s. I was just talking with her just the other day, and she was telling me about her experiences in the boarding school. she was 10 years old when she went to the school. Fortunately, she was not forced to go, but her family made the decision that it would be best for her and her 3 siblings to go. So all 4 of them went to Fort Totten in South Dakota boarding school. But they never got to see each other, even though they were in the same property, the same campus. They never got to see each other because the 2 boys were on one side and her sister were on the other side. And since they were all different age levels, they never saw each other during the day. Fortunately, my great grandparents were allowed to visit. So if they came by once a month on the weekends, they could all get together. So she fortunately was able to see them every now and then. But the one thing she remembered was they just had to wear kind of like a burlap feeling type dress, very uncomfortable clothing. And she remembers they did a lot of marching. And that was what she remembered from her boarding school experience. And then she moved after 1 year. They moved her to another boarding school in Bismarck. And then for high school, she went to the Haskell Indian School in Lawrence, Kansas, which is where she met my grandfather before they moved back to the reservation. For what I do for a living is I work for the Puget Sound Educational Service District as the Native American Education Program Manager. And we serve about 600 students with Native American heritage down in Pierce County school districts, Franklin Pierce, Sumner, Peninsula, and University Place. So I have the opportunity to work with Native students almost every day. And these are descendants of boarding school families. And so it's really amazing to work with them. And sometimes, like I said, they don't usually get to hear about boarding schools unless they're working with myself or my staff. So it's an important job, I think, that we have working with the youth who are not getting it from the schools very often, learning about boarding schools. And just your question about from watching the documentary it was triggering. It was gut wrenching just to, and this is stuff I've known about for, 20, 30 years. I've known about this, and still to watch anytime you watch any documentary on boarding schools, especially Carlisle, because it was the first one, it's really impactful and it's painful and it's hard to watch, but it's important to watch. I had the opportunity to visit Carlisle when I was in grad school back in Pennsylvania. I was in an Indian education program. So myself and my other Native colleagues, we left school. We took I think it's like an hour drive to Carlisle. And we got to the woman that was on the video there, the documentary, who was talking, what was her name? Barb Landis. She was the person we met with about 20 years ago. And it was interesting to watch the documentary because when we met with her, I don't think she quite understood the weight of Carlisle. She was very proud of it. Right. She was like, hey, with this, and they mentioned a little bit in the documentary, this was the school that had Jim Thorpe, the greatest athlete of the 20th century. So that's what they held up about Carlisle. And he was a football player there. And the coach was Pop Warner. And if you know anything about football, Pop Warner is like the foundation of football. And so they had the greatest player and the greatest coach of all time there. And that's what they focused on in the town of Carlisle. And then when they were showing the cemetery there, and that really was very triggering for me because they showed the cemetery. I don't know if you saw it just briefly, it showed a little plaque, but what happened there was the cemetery was up on the campus, and currently it is a war college. So it's an active working war college. So you can't get on the campus without going through a gate. And so we were able to go there for a tour, like the Arapaho people were. And as we got the tour, all the buildings are still there. All those stark white military buildings are still there. And as we're walking around, they casually mentioned to us that the cemetery was actually kind of in the middle of the campus, but at some point in the 80s or 90s, they had to build a road. And so instead of, going around a cemetery, they decided to pick up all of the tombstones and all of the caskets and move the cemetery to the far edge of the campus. And so watching that documentary, and there's the quote that was in the letter, I think, and I had to write it down so I remembered it. There was a quote in the letter where they said they couldn't give the remains back. And they said that this cemetery represents a beautiful tribute to Native Americans, but apparently not enough that they can't move the road around it. And so, just my concern always would have been that were the remains taken care of and put in the right spot with the right tombstone. And I think the documentary even kind of showed you that it may not have been. So that was really hard to watch, just to see how they treated even in death. You know, these children couldn't even be honored. So it was really, really interesting, great documentary. And I just hope people get a chance to watch this and learn more about the boarding school experience, because really what it did, and they talked about, and Ramona talked about it too, was there's that sense of family and community that is lost. You know, when you're taken away from your family, even if it's obviously most of them were literally kidnapped and taken away, but some of them went on their own because the families thought, oh, it's probably best, you know, for the family for financial reasons, or for maybe they didn't want to be native. Like I think my great grandmother wanted my grandma to go because she could maybe get an English education and, you know, do better. But some didn't go. My grandmother luckily was able to go home in the summers and kind of still keep a connection with her family. But a lot of students didn't get to go home, like it said in the documentary. They either were rented out as slave labor, basically. So they didn't go home for 3 or 4 years. They didn't have any contact with their family. So can you imagine being away from being 9 years old, let's just say, and going away until you're 12, and then all of a sudden walking back into your home? You know, you've lost that connection, that love from your parents. And that's just that generational trauma, as they say, just that cycle starts right there. And now you're not being loved by your family. And how do you know how to learn to love? And how do you know to love yourself and to love others? But then you still get married and have children, and no one taught you how to be a parent because you were away at a boarding school for 15 years or 12 years, 10 years. So that it's just, and then also, of course, the mistrust of the educational system. Like, how are we as Native parents supposed to send our kids away to school, or send our kids to school every day and trust that they're getting a good education? And like I said at the beginning of my comments, is 90% of the education they're getting about Native Americans is 1890 and before. We're not talking about, you know, all the great things Ramona Bennett and her constituents did in the 60s and 70s and the 50s, Billy Frank Jr., you know, all the boarding school situations out here. There were 360 boarding schools in the United States, a couple hundred more in Canada. It's a lot of trauma, a lot of bad things that are happening there, and nobody knows about them. Like that, the gentleman said, even the people in Carlisle had no idea that Carlisle had such a terrible history, and it's just not taught. And I think it's important that these people's stories don't die, that these people's stories continue. The victims and the survivors of boarding schools, either from 1890 all the way to 1970, their stories should not die. Their stories need to be told. And it's our job to make sure they are. So I'm glad KBTC is doing this. A lot of Native education programs, you know, around the state, working with the tribes, working with the school districts to try to include this curriculum and this information in their schools is very important.
Thank you, Jason. And I myself too, as you, so you said you're second generation, so that makes me first generation. I come from a family of 9 siblings, and I'm number 7 in line. And I was the first one in my family not to go to boarding school. My parents went to boarding school, my grandparents went to boarding school, and they never really talked about it. And just now, in the last few years, my brothers and sisters are in their late 60s and 70s. They're finally sharing some of the things about that. And it makes me feel really sad that even within our home, they still held to that thinking that, you know, it's not safe. It's not safe to talk about it. And what has always struck me about these boarding schools is there's no accountability. These children were there with these people and no accountability over them. And these, at ages, like we're gonna have a person speak pretty soon, age 3, age 5. My brothers and sisters went to boarding school. My older, they told me just the other day, at 5 years old. So there's nobody there to protect them, nobody there to comfort them. And it's to me, you know, looking at it from that perspective, it's very, very heinous. It's very, very heinous. So the other part of that for me, that it became normalized. It became normalized. This is how it is. Why should we complain? Because dad and mom went to boarding school, grandparents went to boarding school. And so, you know, that's one of the really tough parts about this today, that as I look back upon that as first generation from boarding school, that it's not normal. It is not normal. Something is really wrong about taking people's children, and in like Wind River situation, it's 2,000 miles away to Carlisle. That's all messed up. And so in order for our people to survive all that we went through, you put children in that situation, they have to find a way to survive with whatever they have. And so, yeah, it did become normalized. And my brothers and sisters were not forced to go to boarding school. My parents sent them to boarding school. And so, yeah, the cycle was really very embedded. And thanks for sharing with that. So relate to some of that. And I'm going to go to Valerie. Valerie's joined in with us here, and we're thankful that you came on and listening to discussion this evening. And, you know, your beloved elder there, and she's sharing with you about some of the activism that you're involved in. What comes up for you, and what would you like to share with the people tonight?
Yes, the program was very triggering for me. It reminds me how lucky I am that I did get to come home. I did go to school. If you turned 4 years old before the end of the year, you were sent off to school in August. And my birthday's in November, the end of the month, the end of this month. So I went to school at 3 years old that August.
Could you share the years again when that was?
That'd be 69. 69. And so St. Labre was the first boarding school that I attended. And then the last one was St. X, which was Pretty Eagle School. And that one was in Pryor, Montana. And that one was a day school. And that would have been 6th grade, like junior high time frame for myself.
125, 3-year-olds.
I'm a survivor of the childhood sexual trauma. And it wasn't just the religious leaders, but it was the campus workers as well, who were all part of it, it seemed. I didn't know what it was called, of course, back then. But my childhood memories are that they had always bothered me. I didn't know what sexual abuse was. I didn't even know the term, the word sex. That wasn't. So I didn't know what it was. I just know that they bothered me and made me do things. And like I said, it wasn't just the religious leaders. It was the bus drivers. It was the cafeteria workers that groomed us with food. I was bought for food, which, you know, explains my unhealthy relationship with food now. I'm on a healing journey. I have been, and as soon as I found out about Kamloops, the 215, I called my mom right away and asked her, do you remember a cemetery? Well, she didn't remember one. I didn't remember one. Well, why would we remember one? It wouldn't look like we would expect it to look like, because it's not, nothing's marked. And as we continue to learn about all these children that didn't make it home, count my blessings that we did. You know, we hear about stories that they would run away in the wintertime, and they'd find them frozen, or say that they were adopted out without the family's permission or consent. And now you hear of these families that are being reunited after all of these years because they were sent away to the East Coast or somewhere far from us where we couldn't have a relationship with them. And I'm blessed enough to be able to see these relationships being reconnected. You know, families are growing, and all these adoptions that had happened. And I remember being told that I would amount to nothing but a dumb, dirty, drunken Indian, and thinking to myself that the dirty part I could fix, just keep myself clean. The drunken part I could fix as long as I stayed away from the alcohol. But the dumb part I just couldn't figure out. So I figured, well, 2 out of 3 is still a pretty good person. I could still be a good person. And it wasn't until I got into nursing school that I was tested for dyslexia. So all this time I wasn't dumb. I was just dyslexic. I learn in a different way. But all that time, that is what I was led to believe of myself. Yeah. And the resentment that I have towards the Catholic Church, the life that is stolen from myself and my families. I'm still working on that myself. In my early years, I would say in the 80s, when I found out that praying wasn't a punishment. Praying used to be a punishment. We would have to say prayers, you know, 50 Hail Marys, 100 Our Fathers. So praying to me was a scripted thing. They were things that were already pre-scripted that you had to read. And here all this time, and my mom would always, I couldn't understand why I would have to go to confession. Why do I have to go tell this person that I did wrong when I hadn't done anything? So every week we'd have to go to confession. So I started making up stories, because if I told them the truth, then I would get in trouble. But if I told them a story, then my trouble would be only this big, instead of this big when I told the truth. So the brainwashing, you know, and if you didn't pray in a certain way, then your prayers weren't heard. You know, if you didn't kneel and hold your hands in a certain way, and if you didn't speak into your hands, and you know, that's not how we prayed when we were at home, you know, and but I was blessed enough to have my mother come work. She came to work at the dormitory, and she was one of the dorm moms. So I did get to see my mom, and but she couldn't be there to protect us all the time, and neither could Sister Claire. Sister Claire, I know she knew something because us kids all gravitated towards her, and then she was reassigned. So we always wondered how come all the good ones were reassigned. And how come we couldn't keep Father Manning, you know, all these questions, and are starting to make awful sense now of what it looked like for me as a young girl, and understanding what really happened, and understanding the terminology that goes along with it. You know, when somebody say, were you sexually abused? And I'd say no, because I didn't know what it was. I didn't know that that's what it was. So when and they didn't tell me what it was, they would just ask me these questions. And that terminology was foreign to me. So in the early years, yes, I said yes, that out of fear, if I told, what would happen? And I was told that if I told, that I would be separated from my family forever. So I never told, because I didn't want to end up like other cousins that went away. So it's just been within the last 6 years that I've been able to talk about these things and start to shed that shame card that I've been toting around for a very long time. Thank you for allowing me to speak.
Thank you, Isabella. We're very honored to have you here with us, and with our people's ways and the prayers of our people as you make reconnection. It's our hope and thought that more healing will come to you, and to nurture you. And you're already doing things that are having an impact in your life. And so it's an honor to see that, you know, with you. And yes, we have lost many through alcoholism over the years, and other kinds of things, violence and suicides because of this trauma. And so I'm glad you're here, and I'm glad you've taken care of yourself. You've gone through healing, because if you didn't, we wouldn't hear your story. You'd be gone, but you have. And so,
yes, and that's you know, I was going to just take these stories with me, because who cares? No one cared before. So why talk about them? And it wasn't until Cam Lutz, you know, the beginning. And every time a school and a number would come, it would feel like my heart was being ripped out. And we go through the trauma all over again. And it hasn't ended. And it's going to be a long time before it does, if it does. My continued prayers for the families, and continued prayers for all of us in this healing journey. I just want to honor the people and those who have gone before us.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
I want to say, for those of you who are out there, the knowledge, the general knowledge about boarding schools is in the history of it is very lacking in America. It's something that, again, has not really been talked about. And as you listen tonight, you hear this, you hear over and over the mention of Christian churches and boarding schools. It's important for people to understand and know that there was a direct partnership that was established between the US government and Christian churches to carry this out. There was planning that was done. A few years ago on one of our media sites called Indian Country Today, they put out a research, and on this, they had dug down into the history of education along with boarding schools. And they found that the first federal funding for education, for any kind of education that took place by the US government, was to fund churches to run boarding schools.
Oh, yeah.
That's how deep that this goes. And, you know, all through my growing up in public schools and everything, I always hear about separation church and state, separation church and state, you know, yada, yada, yada. But no, it didn't happen in this case. And it wasn't just a Catholic church. My brothers and sisters and my dad and mom went to a Methodist boarding school. My mother, in her early years, attended a Christian Reform boarding school. There were many churches with this.
Mhm.
I encourage you to take some time and Google boarding schools and Christianity, and you'll begin to see the truth of what was going on in here. And some of the things that are quoted, I read some quotes this past week out of Canada with some of the Christian leaders there. Just really, really, I just have to say, disgusting, shocking, and their statements about the purpose of boarding schools. And they were willingly and knowingly trying to destroy the identity and even the spirit of children that were there. They even made statements in some of the things they were saying that we cannot allow children to go back to their families. And this one bishop was saying, if we do that, all we have is a savage who can read and write. We have to keep them away from their families for long periods of time until they fully are removed and not connected to their way of life. Only then are we successful. So, make sure that you take time to look at that. And I know that in this country, that as more of this truth comes forward, my hope is that there will be an accounting. My hope is that as this truth comes forward, that there will be an accounting. And just like you heard Sylvia talk about here, that there was no accountability going on with this. And these children were alone. There was nobody to protect them. And their parents and families, were not there. They were children, 4, 5 years old. And even into youth, there are stories about abuse that took place within these schools.
And Arlie, if I could just say,
Yeah.
one thing that, just a side note, but the Canadian government has offered a formal apology for the Canadian industrial schools. The United States government, I believe, still has never apologized.
Mm-mm.
And never will.
And probably never will.
So it is important, these kind of programs like this, and it is important wherever you are to face the truth. And as we go forward from here, that, these things are not acceptable. And like I said, it's been embedded, and as Jason was saying, it's been embedded as a good thing that was done to us, and to help tame and educate these savages into somebody who's civilized. The word is used so many times in these texts about civilizing, and all of that. Well, to me, doing this with children very young and telling, I was just reading again, not too long ago, that with the Puyallup tribal school there, that Billy Frank's father was stolen. And he tells a story that he was stolen and taken and forced to go to boarding school.
Well,
So,
yeah.
so to try to, hold up that this was for good and things were done. No, I don't think so. These kind of things would never be allowed today. And if you look at it, a lot of people say it's because of war and all of that business. Well, these are war crimes then. If you want to take it down that road, then these are war crimes that were committed against our children and against us as a people. So I want to say thank you, Ramona. Thank you, Ramona. Let me have you come on one more time. I'd like you to share a little bit about your history of activism, but more importantly, what you shared with me the other day, that the vision of Chief Leschi School. What is that vision today in terms of the history of boarding schools and all of that? And
I'm here.
yeah, would you share with us all again? You mentioned this the other day. What is the mission and purpose of Chief Leschi School? And it is a tribal school, and it's dedicated to what purpose? And for you in your mind, as you were part of the ones who built this school and brought it into being, what purpose did you see in that?
Well, Maisel, Bridges, Suzette Mills, and myself were all on the council, and they did a school at Frank's Landing called Wahilut, and I did a school at Puyallup and named it Chief Leschi, because what I've been taught and told is that when an ancestor hears their name, that it makes them happy. And so all day long, while I was talking to you, I got a call that said Chief Leschi. They were telling me my granddaughter missed school, which she didn't. She has an auntie that drives her there, brings her back, and is there all day. But every day they call me. But I wanted a school where Indian children could laugh, could fight, could cry, could have emotions. And so we did a school. It was the first building we built. All of the other tribes, every single tribe got EDA money, and it was every single tribe but Puyallup did a gymnasium. And they did a gymnasium with no thought of who was going to staff it or how they were going to maintain it. But we did a little elementary school, because what we've been taught and told is that the school is the heart of a community. And so we did a school, and we brought in people to teach language. We brought in children, and with the children came songs. Red Wind Medicine Camp, from the grandparents that remembered. Another thing that we were told is that the only reason any of the languages survived was because some of the kids had tuberculosis and couldn't go to school. And so they got to stay home with their grandparents. And so a lot of our language teachers as children were sickly and didn't get to go to school. And so they were able to keep the languages alive and the songs alive. And so our school is a place where 1,000 Indian children every day can come together and learn together and fight with each other and learn together.
Do you see it as the boarding schools took away so much from our children, and now with the school, Chief Leshai, we're trying to build that back? Is that how you see it?
Exactly. And our kids meet other Indians.
Mm.
And the families stay connected to the school. And we were told there was no point in doing a school like that because Indian parents wouldn't participate. But that is so not true. When we have game night, all the families are there, whether or not they have kids in school. And when we have any kind of an activity, there's a big turnout. The whole community turns out. And so we've proven that that's a bunch of baloney.
Thank you. Thank you. And right now, we've pretty much spent over an hour here, so I think it's time to wrap things up. And so,
Valerie, that wasn't Sylvia, that was Valerie.
oh, Valerie, yeah, thank you for fixing that. I really appreciate that.
Yeah, Valerie, what's your last name?
St. Pierre.
That's right. I apologize, Valerie. Thank you for pointing that out. I appreciate that. So I do want to let listeners know.
Sylvia.
I want listeners to know that KBTC did interview me, and in this interview that will be aired in the coming days, I speak a lot about my experience, like Jason was talking about, as a descendant and as a young father, what the effects of boarding school had on me, even to this day. And I know, Ramona, you talked about being able to speak the language, but I'm not fluent in my language. And this the same thing. My parents made the same decision not to talk to us in our native language because of the boarding school experience. So all my brothers and sisters are the same way. And to this day, it's still a hurtful thing to me. I never had a good conversation with my grandparents within that language. My dad's father could not speak English. And so to this day, it still hurts that I wasn't able to speak to her. The only thing I could say was, give me money, and she would give me money for candy. That's the only thing I knew how to say to her. But yeah, so that interview will be coming up, and I go into more detail about my family and the effects of this intergenerational trauma and what I've been doing to try to heal around that too as well. So thank you again, Ramona. Thank you again, Jason. Appreciate all the work that you're doing out there with our students too. And thank you again, Valerie. So with that, everyone, thank you for listening to today. And a lot of people wonder, what should we do? What should we do? One of the first things that is to do is what you've done tonight, to listen, to be willing to listen and hear these stories. And through this, then you can begin to see the truth of what actually happened. And like I said before, for me, it's the opening of a door, a pathway to where we can stand eye to eye and looking at one another as human beings, and then work together to continue to build a stronger community, a stronger nation, stronger trust between all of us, because we are neighbors in this world. None of us has to be born at this time. We're all here. And so it's one of our important duties to do that. So with that, thank you, everyone. And thank you for our people in the background, Jeffrey, and our captioner, Marie.
Oh.
Thank you.